Good morning, everyone. The Victoria Arts Council respectfully acknowledges the Lekwungen-speaking people within whose traditional territory we operate, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich First Nations, whose historical relationships with this land and diverse cultural heritage continue to this day. We raise our hands in gratitude for the ancestors, matriarchs, the hereditary leaders, and the artists from these lands. We give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. So good morning, my name is Kegan McFadden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Arts Council and co-lead of CreativeMornings Victoria. And got Cass McConkey here, who is the Program Coordinator with VAC, as well as I'm, I guess, now co-lead of CreativeMornings. So I'll pass it over to Cass.
Great, thank you, Kegan. So I'm going to share some slides with everyone. All right, so welcome to Creative Mornings. October's theme is Ethos. With our actions and words, we embody these values and beliefs beyond conscious knowing. In turn, we subtly shape the ethos that our descendants of family and place will receive from us. Ethos is alchemic, ineffable, and infinitely ponderable across place and culture. What ways of moving through the world did you inherit? Our Asheville chapter chose this month's exploration of ethos, and Colin Sutherland illustrated the theme.
Wow.
Thank you to MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official partner for marketing. Whether you're an established agency veteran or a fledgling freelancer, you're always on the hunt for new ways to win new clients. In MailChimp & Co.'s 2022 benchmark report, 40% of respondents said they spent too little time on new business development. For tips to help you learn how to refine your craft and raise your chances of landing your next big project, read MailChimp's 3 strategies for winning new business. Thank you to the City of Victoria and the CRD for their continued support. And thank you to HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. We are from the Victoria Arts Council, and we'd like to share our current exhibition, Gifts from the Ancestors, the debut show by Joshua Watts. Gifts from the Ancestors is informed by Nuu-chulnith histories, legends, and traditional carving techniques. Josh has transformed our VAC main gallery to look like a longhouse as a way of honoring his cultural teachings, while commenting on current societal topics. In our Store Street windows of our main gallery, we have a poem, Welcome Song, written by our speaker today. And we are coming into the last weekend of our exhibition. It closes this Sunday, so please stop in before then if you haven't had a chance to see it already. And without further ado, please welcome our speaker today. So Linnea Jericho is an Indigenous Niska, Tsimshian, Kwakwak writer, orator, and advocate with a special interest in healing through art. She has worked with the University of British Columbia on several projects, including an exhibition, an accompanying book, as well as publishing in places such as Sea Magazine. Through her work, she hopes to empower others to share their own stories and gifts. I'll now pass it over to Linnea.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I will reintroduce myself into the space because it's part of my teachings. That's how we call our ancestors to us. That's how we shift the energy around us to be welcoming for what we have to offer. And so my name is Linnea. I go by Linnea Jericho or Linnea Dick, and my Kwakwak name is Malady, which means to always find your path in life. And so I guess it's kind of hard to define in English terminology, but it's to know where your destination is, to see it, but on your way there, you're led to these very many different places, and that each one of those places on your way to the destination is where you're meant to be. And it's with that power that I've been led here today. And it's with that power that a lot of the things I have in my life have come to me. So I'm very grateful for that name. I am Nishka, Tsimshian, and Kwakwaka'wakw, Nishka and Tsimshian on my mother's side and Kwakwaka'wakw on my father's side. I come from a matrilineal family on my mother's side, and that was something my dad always honored. And I wear a lot of hats. I am a writer, a sometimes curator. I work in the youth mental health field. I do some social media graphic design. I go where my spirit is called. But I think the one thing that connects a lot of those things is my love for creativity and creative spirit, and my belief in that creative spirit being one of the most healing things for us in this modern society because of the disconnection we may have to that spirit. I will also just disclaimer and let you know that I am currently a cancer patient, and I am not feeling 100% today. I'm feeling a little nauseous because I decided not to take my anti-nausea medication so that I could be clear-minded for you today. But that just might mean might be moments where I just need to take a deep breath and just gather myself. So I just wanted to let you know that before I begin. And then something I really like to do to add to the land acknowledgement is not only to acknowledge the land that I stand on and the ancestors that have taken care of that land for so long, but I also like to acknowledge her own story, that the land beneath me, long before people ever stepped foot on her, has her own story. And that story has changed her and shaped her. And it's just an honor to be welcomed into her story and to be here today. When I was given the topic of ethos, I think I was a little bit nervous, to be honest. I often have heard this term as more of a scholarly term, although it's also a philosophical term. It's not one that I would speak about very often. And I was just telling Kagan a kind of funny story yesterday that my partner and we both decided to do these creative morning talks. And when he came to me, he came with these two topics. And he said, okay, I chose this one, you're going to do ethos. And I thought it was really funny because I personally would have chosen the other one, but I also am someone who really likes to challenge myself. And so I'm grateful that I'm able to talk about this today. My understanding of ethos does come from that philosophical place. And one of my first understandings of ethos comes from a book called Care of the Soul. And that term specifically wasn't represented in that book, but the term pathos was represented. So I kind of wanted to briefly talk about ethos, pathos, and logos, because that was where I first came to understand. So our ethos is our character, or these guiding principles, these guiding ethics, these guiding values and beliefs that we hold that create our character. That's what our ethos is. Our pathos is our emotions, our passions, the things that excite us or bring us joy. And then our logos is our logic. And I don't have much more to say than that because I come from the ethos and pathos places more often than the logos place. I learned something very interesting recently that is very relevant to this conversation that I just found really interesting, because for me, I find that I'm someone that just leads with my heart. I often lead with my emotions, and I've always found that to be a strength. But I came across something recently that said, essentially you could make a decision out of your character and you will still be you, but you can make a decision out of your emotions and it could still be out of character for you. And so I believe that our emotions are a really beautiful place to come from, but our ethos arguably could be more important because our character and who we are and who we become in life is what is going to shape the world around us the most. And it's what's going to shape our children's lives. It's what's going to be passed on to the next generation. Our personal emotions, our personal passions, the things that we personally enjoy are things that can also be passed on, but it's not necessarily going to determine the kind of character that someone has. And so learning about that shifted my perspective of what it means to have those ethical guides in our lives, because I had a bias. I come from that place of passion and emotion, but I also hadn't realized that I had a strong character, that despite what I feel for things, that ethos is guiding me. And I just wasn't aware until I was put in a position to do this talk. And then that knowledge came to me later, which again is that power of malady. It's just all coming together for me. And I did want to touch on the ethos of being an Indigenous person, because I think that that is a lot of what guides me in life. And I think that the ethos of Indigenous people, the things that guide our character, is drastically different from the ethos of modern or Western society, or even the post-colonial world. And so some examples of those different Indigenous ethos would be, I grew up knowing that generosity is the best measure of wealth, that the person who gives the most to their community is the wealthiest. I grew up in a community that acknowledged that all people have their own gifts and that there's a place for all of those people in life. I grew up with an ethos that reminded me to appreciate and love nature and all of life around me. And of course, there's some other teachings too about being kind and helping our communities, and collective healing is a part of our ethos. It's something that we do together when we participate in ceremony. And I think that one of the challenges for Indigenous people can be that the ethos that guides our modern world is drastically different, that the things that are acceptable within this world may not be acceptable within an Indigenous ethos with those teachings that we grew up with. And I think the biggest example that we have right now is the overconsumption, especially when it comes to our forests and our waterways being polluted. And I think the difficult part in understanding for Indigenous people is that we don't come from that idea that wealth is what you acquire. It's not material. It's not measured in money or numbers or what you have around you. Our ethos is what you have that you can give to others. And what we see with this overconsumption that's happening is people being displaced and being, not being able to have homes. 1% of the world becoming really rich while the rest of the people are struggling, especially right now with inflation. And so I think the disconnect often comes from that ethos, not of our communities now, but the ancestors and the history of value that we come from. And I have often found it very interesting that sometimes when Indigenous people come from that place of wanting to share what our values, what our beliefs on the world is with the world to make the world a better place for all of humanity, that the retort or the argument is often, well, if you don't like it, why don't you stop using phones? Why don't you go back to living on the land? And that I have always found the argument interesting, because that has nothing to do with our ethos. Because I'll have you know that Indigenous people have always been innovative. Indigenous people have always embraced that there's more to learn and that there's ways that we could make our lives easier or more beautiful in some kind of way. And so this idea that we need to throw out our phones, even though we ourselves are an innovative people, is bizarre to me. So that disconnection of those two different ethos, I would say, is one of the biggest conflicts and challenges when it comes to Indigenous issues or social justice advocacy. I find that for Indigenous people that maybe it is a bit easier to understand that ethos that we come from and what we believe, because it's very well represented in our mythology, in the scholarly world or in the educational world. Our ethos or that character is often referenced in writing, that a very well-written story about a person will be very clear on what their ethos is. And although we didn't come from a written history, we come from an oral history, that character is very strong in all of our stories and represented in the mythology we share, but also the historical stories that we share with each other. That often these people had special qualities that made them stand out because of their beliefs and their values and how they related to others. And I will say that when I grew up in the education system and away from my community, I actually grew up more urban. So I grew up away from my Indigenous backgrounds, that the stories that I heard weren't as strong. And there was a time in my life where I was ashamed to be Indigenous. And the thing that actually made me feel less shame was I took a women's studies class. And in that women's studies class, the way that the teacher taught us was to share all these stories. So she'd get us to read something and then reflect on it, and read something and reflect on it. And during this, I was not realizing I was developing a really strong ethos. I was developing a really strong belief and value about things, and an understanding of the different ways that I may be able to make the world a better place. And that is where I fell in love with storytelling. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the strong characters in the stories that we tell, and in mythology and in our historical retellings of stories. But it's also important to make that become a part of our ethos, is being aware of the stories we're telling to others and how that could impact their own becoming of who they are and their own character. I will also say there's a huge difference between our personal ethics and our community ethics or ethos. I very much have been guided by my Indigenous ancestry for sure, but specifically having a father who was a really amazing leader, a lot of things that he passed on to me has become a part of my personal ethos. So there is a way that we may behave when it comes to our communities or the different groups we're a part of. But there's also something within us that is our very personal character, and they could be related to each other, but they're not necessarily always the same, because ethics are different depending on the spaces that you're in. And how I kind of learned that was when I was growing up. I had someone in my family who had gone to residential school raise us with a lot of ethical rules. So she would often remind us to be ethical in different ways, but the ethical teachings that she was sharing with us were rooted in shame. And one thing that's different from our individual character and our character that's guided by a group is that in this group character that we have, it's easy to become shamed in the group for not following what their particular ethos is. And so I think it's really, really important to establish a strong individual character and to know who you are. And I mean, this is something, when I was 16, I thought I knew who I was. When I was 21, I thought I knew who I was. I'm 30 now. I think I know who I am. And it's going to continue to change. But I noticed that the way I represented myself ethically in all these different spaces wasn't necessarily always true to my own personal ethos, though I was accommodating the ethos of others in the different spaces that I was. And so that is also a very interesting thing about how our character or how those ethics show up in different spaces. I mean, the character I have could be slightly different than the character I have growing up in an Indigenous community, which is also different than the character I have growing up in an artist community. And all these different things can come together in really beautiful ways, but also sometimes they can be very separate from each other. But when I was experiencing the shame of ethics, I didn't realize that it had nothing to do with me. And something I know now is that our ethos and what we believe is the way that people should ethically behave or ethically do things does not necessarily reflect good or bad. When we think of character, we sometimes think of good or bad. But say when, I'll just, call myself out here, but this morning, Sephora started their 20% off sale. And I went on there and bought a bunch of makeup. For one person's ethos, they might say, wow, good for you for doing something creative and doing something you're passionate about. Good for you for doing something that is going to allow you to express yourself. But someone with a different ethos might say, that's consumerism. I don't know why you would spend so much money on in a store that is really big and, you know, produces a lot of waste and all of these different things. Now, does that mean that I was a good person or a bad person for doing that? I don't believe so. And so I think that sometimes with that shame, the waters become really muddied with people can use shame as a way to appeal to our ethos, the same way that people can use emotional manipulation to appeal to our pathos, the same way people can use being condescending to appeal to our logos. Yeah, so that's pretty much just the thoughts that have come to me and poured out my mouth. Like I said, I am much more of a philosophical, emotional, passionate person, but I also enjoy talking about things that maybe people wouldn't expect from me, because it lets you know a little bit more about my character and my ethos and the way that I transform and grow and become a different person when I am given different spaces. And so that is my talk. I don't know if anyone has questions or anything like that, but I'll hand it back to the host to maybe facilitate that space.
Thank you so much, Linnea. Yeah, round of applause. That was lovely. And I think you opened up so many avenues that we can go down. I was making notes all over the place on my paper here. This idea of your Indigenous name, Melody, and how it can allow you to understand where you are on your journey in different ways, and what's coming towards you is what's needed at that moment. And I think that's so important. And I do want to also really acknowledge your bravery and your transparency around your illness this morning. And so thank you for us showing up that way. And one of the notes I made, though, very quickly, because we didn't get a chance to talk about this, is how you use graphic design for your social justice work, and what that kind of looks like. I didn't know that about you, so I was surprised about this, and how maybe you can talk just a little bit about that method of working, and maybe how that dovetails with Ethos.
Yeah, so for me, my graphic design started about 5 years ago. I started working for a not-for-profit organization called We Matter as a social media coordinator, and I actually had no experience doing social media, but I am a very creative person, and Canva is amazing. Yeah. So the way that I approach using graphic arts to create a message when it comes to mental health or maybe Indigenous issues is to more focus on the outcome that you would desire for someone else. So if I see that the Indigenous communities are suffering because of something that has happened, and this happened actually recently, where a young person was murdered, and Indigenous people, we grieve together, we mourn together. And it's heartbreaking, because a lot of the times the things, when we see those things, they're things that are reflected in our own communities as well. But I thought a long time, because I really wanted to acknowledge it, but I wanted to acknowledge it in a way that would be safe for people who are struggling, who are grieving. And so I made a carousel of cards that had different quotes on them, but they all started with Indigenous youth deserve, and then a word. And so one of those cards was Indigenous youth deserve to be protected. Indigenous youth deserve to feel safe. Indigenous youth deserve justice. And the reason I choose to communicate that way is because it's affirming language. And that's something I learned from my dad. That's something that's part of my own ethos, because when I was young and I used to go to my dad about an authority or some person, maybe a friend who had hurt me, and I was venting and sharing what they had done, my dad would often say that sometimes the best thing you can learn from anyone is how not to be, and to decide for yourself to never cause that same pain for someone else. And so this created something within my mind where when life feels unfair and it feels like it's attacking me, I wonder, how can I make the world a better place through something I do? And also that is how I operate on my own social media. And how I've learned to fulfill myself. There was a time in my own life, I was going to say my poetry career, but I was a kid. There was this time when I was young and I would write poetry and it was all dark. Sylvia Plath was my favorite poet, and her stuff is very dark. And so all of my poems were reflections of that deep sorrow that I felt in my soul and the angst of just being a young person. You start realizing that the people you admire aren't as perfect as they used to be, or you start noticing when people mistreat you. And so it's a really difficult time in life. But I found that I was never feeling better when I was doing that. And I eventually went to art therapy. And art therapy was a little in between, where sometimes she would push the negative and make me express it artistically all the way, not to, build a wall and just share a little bit. But sometimes she would say, okay, but what if it was the way that you wanted it? What if it was the ideal situation? What's your ideal emotion you'd feel right now, or things like this? And so what I learned to do with my poetry is to write myself love notes of what I need. And so if I felt very fearful, that I would write a poem about this woman who has so much courage. And it didn't happen right away. There was many times in my life where my dad had said that thing to me, and I would say, oh, like, you just don't get it. You're so annoying, because I was also a very normal human being. But without him teaching me with that, and without going through that process, I never would have learned that. And so for me personally, when it comes to social justice and when it comes to expressing the difference I want to make in the world, I tend to come from that place of like, what is one way I can make the world just a little bit more beautiful with my action right now, whether it's a big action or just a small action, just a small message that I am putting out there. The other thing I learned was to care a little bit less about the group ethos, and remember that I can only come from the place of being myself, especially on my personal social media. It's been a challenge over the years to learn to show up as myself. And the way I see it now is I can only be myself with the intention of making the world a better place. But the reality is that maybe just one person will read it and it will make their world a better place. Maybe 9 other people will read it and they don't like it. But I can't be for everyone and still fulfill my purpose in life. So I need to be strong in my character and know that this character is bringing me to where I want to end up ultimately, which is just as someone who's made a difference in the world in some kind of positive way.
That's great, thank you. I'm just looking at the chat. The chat is blowing up here. So thank you everyone for putting your comments there. And Linnea can peek into there and see. But I did want to, there's one question from Simona. And Simona has said, thank you so much, Linnea, for your speech. You expressed a lovely concept. Our emotions are a beautiful place to come from. Do you think that our logos can help us not be overwhelmed by our emotions, to find a better balance and still be true to what we come from?
Yeah, so that's a difficult thing for me personally to determine, just because of I personally find that logic can be really offensive to me. Because I'm someone who likes to show up as who I am in a moment, logic feels a little bit predetermined and like it can't be changed. And so for me, it's very hard for me to connect with the idea of logic. However, yes, it can be a really healing space. And I think I would see this in my own relationship, where Josh and I have been together for almost 6 years now. And in the beginning of our relationship, I always come from that emotional place. And so when things were going on in my life and I was feeling overwhelmed, of course, I'd vent to the person who's right beside me. And Josh would always have logical reasons for why things happened that way, or logical problem solving of ways that I could fix the situation that I was in. For me personally, I need my pathos to be acknowledged before I can be logical. So, but I did also need to learn to embrace the logic. And so the way that Josh and I have those conversations now is that he knows to just acknowledge me, acknowledge my pathos, acknowledge my emotions, the passions, the different things that are causing me to feel bad or feel hurt or challenged in some kind of way. But once those emotions are acknowledged, I'm open to receiving the logic. I'm then able to say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I can change my situation. And so I think for all people, it's going to be very different. I have this like my own theory, and it's about heart, body, mind, spirit, and that we all have these 4 parts of ourselves. It's part of our whole selves, and we need to nourish each of these parts of ourselves. But for some people, they lead with their heart. So there could be 2 people, they're both artists, but one artist is just pouring all of their emotions into everything. But another artist is intellectualizing their art because they lead with their mind. So they think about, what's my technique going to be? What's my process going to be? What am I going to create? They think about it a lot more than they feel about it. And then there's our spirit, the artist who creates maybe otherworldly things, or creates art for a spiritual purpose. We see this a lot in Indigenous communities when art isn't being created for profit, but is being created so that we can share it together as a community in ceremony. And then there's our body, and some people lead with their body. And so, you know, like performance artists, they're so great at moving their body, and that's the place that they come from. So I believe that we all kind of have a primary guiding thing about us. And it doesn't mean that we don't have those other parts about us, but it means that our process is going to be different. And I would say that that would still apply with ethos, pathos, and logos. There might be one that's easier for us to lead with, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't acknowledge all three. But when it comes to you and your personal life, always go from the place that you lead from, because that's who you are. And you will get to the other places when you need to. I think for everyone's healing too of emotions, it looks different. For example, me talking about my emotions, really helpful. I have no problems being vulnerable, open. I have no problems crying in front of others. For someone else, that wouldn't feel safe or comfortable, and they might walk away from that feeling worse and feeling ashamed and feeling like, oh, I shouldn't have broke down in front of somebody else. And so really, when it comes to like healing any parts of ourselves, it's about just learning more about us and paying attention to the kind of patterns in our lives. Because for a long time, I thought that I was someone who was led by my heart. But I realize now, after coming up with this own theory that I just had to come up with for myself to give me some guidance in life, I actually come from that spiritual place. That's the easy place for me to come from. And so it just takes a lot of learning, and you won't always get it right. And sometimes, yes, you will learn a way of healing. Maybe it's true. Maybe logos is a way that you can heal your pathos. And it works one time, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the same the next time. So yeah, just, I don't know if that's helpful because it's very indirect of an answer, but it's just really learning about you and what guides you and what fulfills you. And that's how we learn how we heal different parts of ourselves, whether it be our emotions or healing our body or healing our mind.
Yeah, so much of your answer to that question had me thinking about the poem in the window. And there's many hints to it, I think, in what you just said. So I've asked Cass to pull up the slide for the poem just so we can all reacquaint ourselves with it. And then I was hoping, Lynn, if you could actually address how you came across or how you came up with this work, but also the sort of sly nod to your father in it as well, because I think that references a lot of what you just said.
Yes. Okay. So I'm just going to read it out loud just because the poet in me sees it here and it makes me want to do that. But it goes, there are those who walk past doors, welcoming them to step into a supernatural world, but not you. And my process for writing is always a little bit different depending on what's going on at the time. And admittedly, I was losing it over this because I have been really challenged writing ever since going through cancer treatments the first time. And it's because my mind is healing. So there's some chemo fog there. And I was really struggling to come up with like a concept or like what should it say on these windows. It was important to me that it was being seen from the outside to in some way welcome people in, because in our communities, or in my specific communities, welcoming is a huge part of our culture. And, we have welcome songs and welcome rituals. And we all, when someone new comes to our town, we all show the welcoming by having open arms and asking them about their families and asking them what they're doing here and how long they're going to be here, even when they're strangers. And so I thought that because Josh's exhibition was so focused on the traditional elements of things, I wanted that welcome to be really strong so that people felt like they were included in the important art that was being shared, that they felt like they could be a part of the story in some kind of way. And that was part of how I got the idea. And then, of course, with the number of panels, I wanted to have one word per window. And yeah, so the interesting thing with this was I was really caught up in wanting to impress Josh, wanting people who walked by to be intrigued, wanting people to understand what I meant, all these different things. I actually had to push all that stuff aside and just sit with my own energy and think to myself, like, what is a way to welcome people, but at the same time challenge them, knowing that a lot of people will just walk by. And a part of that challenge was also because I see people walk by injustice all the time, or I see people walk by, you know, a homeless person as if they don't matter all the time. And so a part of it was also meant to be a challenge. And it's interesting because it is kind of challenging the ethos of someone in some kind of way, even though I didn't know what the topic of this was going to be. Yeah, so that's how I came into it. And I also didn't know the doors were going to be put in at the time I wrote this. So it's very just, it all came together in a very like magical way. I love when all those little threads in the universe start connecting, and then I'm like, oh, okay, you know, there's something out there looking over and saying you're on the right track. But I think you had a specific question and I don't know if I answered it.
Oh no, you absolutely did. Thank you so much for the reading, and you know, I think you more than answered it really when you opened up about the different ways of interpreting this particular work. But the one thing that I did ask too was the last three words and sort of what that reference is.
Yeah. So the but not you kind of thing is, yeah, definitely a reference to my dad and the very many cheeky ways that he gave that message. Sometimes he would be very direct about it. So he would say, you know, some people do this or that, but not you, you're not like that. But one of the specific memories I have of him saying that to me was actually because I am a philosopher and I never identified myself that way at the time. And we were sitting in his workshop, and there had actually been other people in that workshop with us at the time. And he started talking about social justice, culture, and, you know, a little bit of politics and just all these different things. And he could be intense. My dad could be very intense. And so he had this very like forceful way of communicating sometimes. And he would get up out of his chair and lean in and almost seem like he was like I don't want to say yelling at you, but it could feel that way just with his intensity. And it was an intensity of emotion. It wasn't like directed towards you. But anyway, so he ended up going on this big rant and sharing all these different things that he believed that our culture taught peoples. And for me, I just sat there the whole time listening. And I was just like hanging on to every word. And I was just thinking, like, what is he going to say next? Because everything he was saying was so not the norm of what you would hear in a normal conversation or a normal conversation. But these are conversations I grew up with, mind you. But eventually others, you know, got up and walked out of the room and just kind of quietly left. And about an hour and a half later, I was still sitting there. And at the end of it, he goes, wow, you know, so many people would have gotten up and left by now, but not you, because you're a philosopher and you have that craving for knowledge. And so I actually got to the point in this, and there's so many other ways. I don't know, Kagan, if I told you this story, but there's so many different stories in which I could reference him saying that. So I'm not sure if that was the one. But what happened was I got to the point in the in my poem where it says to step into a supernatural world. And then I only had 3 windows left. So I was like, okay, like, how can I drive this message home? And then in a playful way, my dad's voice came to me, and I thought that was the way, was to challenge people, but to also keep it playful, to keep it like lighthearted. And yeah, so that's how I came up with those 3 little words. And they're so simple, but they change the entire poem, those 3 words.
Absolutely, they do. Yeah. Thank you so much, Linnea. It's now noon, so we always let people know that it is, if you have somewhere to be. I think we got time for one more question if there's anything in the chat, or a lot of people are saying thank you and how wonderful this conversation has been, which I want to echo as well. Yeah, so this talk, like we know, is being recorded and it'll be uploaded later this weekend. So if anyone wants to revisit any of these points that Linnea has made over the last hour, it'll be available, and you can share that video as well. So thank you again, Linnea. Thank you everyone for showing up. And I'll just say the next Creative Morning is going to be the last Friday of November with Debbie Duez. And Debbie is an art therapist, and she will be speaking on the topic of truth, which is, yeah, and Debbie will be, we're working with her for a presentation of an exhibition called Art of Reconciliation. And so Debbie, in her teachings, has been, and in her practice, has been bringing settler and Indigenous youth together to discuss what it means, what reconciliation means through art. So we're really happy to be showing some of that work throughout November. And yeah, log on to Creative Mornings the last Friday at 11 a.m. and you can hear what Debbie has to say about truth. But until then, thanks everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.